Well, thank you very much for that very generous introduction. It's always a tremendous pleasure to be back here at the Nimitz. So this is what I'm going to touch on as briefly as possible to get us warmed up and set to go. And let me start with the Manhattan Project. This was an American organization. It was instituted in 1942. Its mission was to build atomic bombs within the time frame of World War II. As historian Barton Bernstein pointed out many years ago, it started with an implicit assumption that if bombs could be built, they would be used. Now, there were two prongs to the Manhattan Project. One was science. It was headed up by Dr. Robert Oppenheimer. And, of course, that was subject to a great movie last year, which I highly recommend. The science was critical, the whole concept that you could make an atomic bomb, and then the technical details of actually making them. But to have an atomic bomb in the time frame of World War II required fissionable material. That was an enormous engineering project that was headed up by General Leslie Groves, and that was really the sticking point as to whether we would have bombs in World War II. Groves also gave us one other important insight, and that was from the start. He said it would take two bombs to end the war with Japan, the first bomb to establish that the U.S. had an atomic bomb, and a second bomb to establish that we had, or bluff, that we had an arsenal, and we could use the bombs to end the war rather than any other means of ending the war. Now, let me talk briefly about the strategic war goals. On the U.S. side, President Franklin Roosevelt had set the U.S. national war goal as the unconditional surrender of the Axis powers. This was not simply a slogan for victory. This was really a program for peace. Unconditional surrender would give the U.S. the authority, which did not exist under the international law of military occupation, to go in and do fundamental reforms internally in Germany and Japan. And those internal reforms are what guaranteed that we would have an enduring peace. On the Japanese side, things were not so simple. The first thing you need to understand is that Japan had perhaps the most dysfunctional military and political decision-making apparatus in all of the major powers in World War II. The emperor was divine, he was supreme, but he was a presider, not a decider. He'd been emperor since 1925. He had, prior to August 1945, intervened to directly command the Japanese government to do anything only once in February 1936 in the face of a coup d'etat in Tokyo. Other than that, he had simply sanctioned policies presented to him by his civilian and military subordinates. Now, at the beginning of 1945, the Japanese government at that time adopted a strategic policy called Ketsugo, Operation Decisive. This was based upon the notion that the Americans were impatient. They would come and invade Japan, and this would provide the Japanese with an opportunity to either defeat or inflict such heavy casualties on that initial invasion that the Americans would settle for something less than unconditional surrender. And they correctly identified where it was going to take place and began enormous buildup on that. And the government that was then in power, and then the subsequent government, which was in control in August 1945, under a prime minister named Suzuki, they abided by this and steered by this entirely until August 1945. I should point out that one other aspect about the situation was that the real power was in the hands of what was called the Big Six, an inner cabinet. It had only one civilian in it, the foreign minister Togo, and it was Japanese consensus culture in spades, because the Big Six could only act when it voted unanimously 6-0 to adopt any policy. And that's going to figure very prominently in the history of August 1945. Very briefly, we had massive penetration of Japanese communications. We usually refer to that as code breaking. There were some other aspects of it. But basically, they showed, certainly as you got to the latter part of July 1945, the Japanese diplomatic initiative attempting to enlist the Soviet Union was going nowhere. And secondly, and most importantly, it revealed the Japanese had exactly anticipated the American strategy to invade Japan in November 1945, called Operation Olympic. The slide you see that's on the left-hand side is what we thought we were going to get. When President Truman adopted the policy in June 1945, this is what we thought we were going to get. We were going to have overwhelming forces going into southern Kyushu. And what you see on the right is what we were actually going to get. And in fact, the Navy is moving to kill any invasion of Japan as the war comes to an end. Now, let me talk about August 1945, rapid blows. The bomb is dropped on Hiroshima on the 6th. On the 8th of August, Emperor Hirohito meets with Foreign Minister Togo and tells him the war must end right now. And Togo's account of that was confirmed later by a member of the imperial household staff who submitted a memorandum quoting Togo and the emperor almost word for word. And I originally had been skeptical about that, but now I believe that that is true, and we know that the emperor had moved to decide to end the war after Hiroshima, but before the other events we're going to cover. Then we have the Soviet Union entering the war on the night of the 8th and 9th of 1945, and then on August 9th we have the Nagasaki bomb. How the war ended. The important thing to remember here is that it's two steps, not simply one. First of all, someone with legitimate authority had to decide Japan as a nation state would surrender. And secondly, then Japan's armed forces had to comply with that surrender decision. And neither one of those steps was clear as we entered August 1945. We actually know now that the emperor was the figure who decided that Japan as a nation state would surrender. It started on August 8th, and then he had to make that formally to the inner cabinet on in the early hours of August 10th. He had to come back and reaffirm the decision on the 14th, and then did a national broadcast on August 15th announcing that the war was ending. He never used the word surrender. So why did the emperor decide? If you go back as a lawyer, which is one of my trades, you look at what the individual said at the time, what is recorded at the time, you attach the highest value to that. If you look at those aspects of Emperor Hiro's decision-making, you find that, first of all, he had lost faith in Ketsugo because he'd been advised that the preparations were not adequate. He also spoke repeatedly of both conventional and atomic bombings. And thirdly, he spoke both within the inner councils and also in his broadcast on August 15th of what he called the domestic situation. This was a Japanese euphemism for the fact that within the leadership, starting at the emperor and permeating through quite a number of the high-level officials, there was deep fear that the Japanese people, primarily because of the blockade and the bombardment strategy that was going on, and their recognition that the rice crop in 1945 was going to fail, that by the fall, the Japanese people were going to reach a revolutionary state and overthrow the government. And that's what the Japanese were referring to when they talked about the domestic situation. In fact, one of the members of the Big Six, Admiral Nimitz, the Navy minister, would tell one of his aides on August 13th that he said, in a way, Soviet intervention and the atomic bombs are gifts from the gods, because now we don't have to admit that the real reason we're going to surrender is the domestic situation. The emperor's intervention, as he well knew, and other members of the leadership knew, was not a guarantee that the fighting would stop. You had to have the armed forces comply with the surrender. And that was not a given in Imperial Japan in 1945. So why did the armed forces finally comply? Well, there were two important steps to this. The first of which was when they heard on August 7th the news of the bombing of Hiroshima and that Truman had said an atomic bomb was being used, the leadership, the Big Six, met. You'll notice they didn't turn to a group of experts to explain to them what an atomic bomb was, because Japan had its own atomic bomb program and they knew what an atomic bomb was. More importantly, what they knew was this. The Imperial Army said, we're not going to concede that the Americans have an atomic bomb until we have an investigation. The Imperial Navy said, basically, maybe the Americans have one bomb, but they can't have that many. They won't be that powerful. Maybe they'll be dissuaded from use. And that's why the Nagasaki bomb was critical, because it established, or at least it created the bluff, that we had an arsenal of atomic weapons, and we would go ahead and continue to use those. There would be no invasion, and Ketsugo was invalid. The other thing the bombs did, which was mentioned later by many Japanese officers, was that the supreme conceit of the Imperial Army and the Imperial Navy was the Japanese spirit was superior to all others. Certainly no nation like the United States had superior spirit. But what the bombs did was it gave the Japanese the balm of believing that they were never overcome, their spirit was never overcome. They were overcome by supernatural forces. And finally, let me talk about the moral calculus. Quite simply, if you look at this slide, this is Japanese civilian casualties as best we understand them now, about 1 million to 1.2 million. If you take that image as representing 1 million deaths, that represents Japanese civilian deaths in the entirety of the Asia-Pacific War. If you look at that, those are about 18 million other civilian deaths. Most of them are Chinese, Indonesians, or Vietnamese. And that's what I call the moral calculus. This is a whole issue which is not one for any sort of triumphalist narrative, in my view. It's one for sober reflection. But it is, in fact, very important to go back and confront the facts, both factually and morally. Thank you.